And I'm so excited to do this session, not only because I'm working currently in the Baroque department, so I'm working at the National Gallery on paintings from 1600 to 1800. So it's really fun for me to look into a picture for the first time in my area. But also because it really is the first time I've personally looked into Caravaggio in isolation since I lived in Rome in 2011. But what's interesting is Caravaggio was not, in fact, a Roman artist. He is not from Rome. And I think that's often misunderstood. He was born in, believe it or not, a place called Caravaggio, which is just near Bergamo in Lombardy. His name is, in fact, you may have found the email confusing, his name is in fact Michelangelo Merisi, but he is called Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, which means from Caravaggio. And he has come to be known as Caravaggio. But we do know that he arrived in Rome in 1592. He is very poor. He's sort of moving from artist studio to artist studio, trying to get what work he can and what training he can. There are a number of names of different artists that he ends up sort of training with, one of which we know is an artist, a very famous artist at the time called Cavaliere d'Arpino. And with him, we know that Caravaggio very much trained in painting fruit and flowers. He gets the attention and becomes very popular with three brothers called the Mattei brothers. And the Mattei brothers commissioned over the course of 2 years, they commissioned 3 works from Caravaggio. And it was during this time that he paints the Supper at Emmaus, which is the painting that we're looking at here. So Caravaggio paints this painting. It's sort of unusual for a number of reasons, and I'm going to take you through them sort of one by one. Now, of course, many of you will know that what he's most famous for is this incredible theatrical light that he uses in his paintings. And this was something that was to have a huge impact, not only on his contemporaries, but really going forward across Europe in the 17th century. And it's not only used or employed by Caravaggio for its kind of aesthetic purposes, but it's really also, it enhances the meaning of the painting. It's the narrative from the 3rd day of after Christ's resurrection. And 2 disciples are walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and they come across a man who comes to dine with them. And it's during this time, during this meal, that they realize that this man that they have encountered is in fact the resurrected Christ, the risen Christ. And they know that from the moment at which he blesses the bread. And what Caravaggio has very innovatively done here is he is depicting the moment at which they realize that he is Jesus Christ. Now, what's amazing is that the light is shining, of course, directly onto the face of Christ, and also on these 2 disciples who we can see either side of him seated, one of which on the left is kind of springing up from his chair in shock, and the other is sort of flaying his arms out to either side. And this man who's standing at the back of the scene, who doesn't seem to really be expressing much sort of surprise at all, and he's very much in the dark. And this is, of course, a kind of relevance to the meaning of the painting, that these disciples have literally kind of seen the light, and that the innkeeper is literally sort of in the dark, and he is not able to sort of witness this revelation, and Christ sort of revealing himself and then shortly afterwards disappearing. Another fantastic feature of the light here is this the kind of shadow that's cast by the cap of the innkeeper on the left, and how it sort of creates this sort of dark halo, surely not a coincidence, over the head of Christ at the center there. Another shadow which is particularly interesting to look at is, you can probably see my mouse, is this shadow that's cast from this precarious looking basket of fruit here on the white tablecloth. Now, that looks to me like a fish, which of course is again a reference to Christ and the loaves of bread and the fish, the miracle of Christ feeding the 4,000 and the 5,000 in the New Testament. So the fish is often a kind of emblem of Christ, and Caravaggio subtly uses that here in the shadow of this kind of groaning basket of fruit. So the theatrical nature of the composition is not really only just from the light, but also from the way in which he's kind of positioned the kind of characters, if we're thinking of theatre. So you have Cleo Pass with this amazing sort of three-quarter profile, which is sort of quite unusual because he's kind of impairing our sight of some of the table, which is behind him. But this does actually start to be used in the 16th century, this sort of figure turned inwards, and it does, of course, create a kind of sense of depth within the canvas. And we see Raphael doing it quite a lot, sort of, sort of 80 years earlier, let's say. But by having him kind of positioned like that, and then this space between him and the other disciple, and by having this very tight crop, I mean, I'm showing you here the picture. So we are positioned kind of in that space and just willing ourselves to push that basket of fruit back onto the table because it looks like it's about to drop off. And this is all probably in Caravaggio's thinking, you know, the idea of drawing us in, and this amazing foreshortening of the elbow of Cleopas on the left, and of course the hand that's sort of pushing out towards us of the disciple on the right. And one thing I realized when I was looking at this painting this afternoon is we can't see anyone's feet. Now, that might sound quite obvious, but interestingly, for those of you who know The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, which I'm sure many of you do, that has often been quoted as a kind of precursor, not to this painting necessarily, but to a painting by Titian of the Supper at Emmaus, which was painted in around 1530, which was in turn sort of thought to have inspired this picture by Caravaggio. And in both Titian and Leonardo's compositions, one of the most wonderful features, and I implore you to all Google it after this, is the feet, both in the Last Supper, but particularly in the Supper at Emmaus by Titian, where you see sort of dogs and things under the table playing with cats and feet, and you very much are kind of away from the picture, even though there's this sort of one-sided sort of supper table, you aren't kind of in the picture. Whereas, of course, if we were sitting at the table, I wouldn't be able to see anyone's feet. But many of you have probably, having looked at all the different figures that we've been talking about, been kind of drawn by this wonderful still life that we see on the table here, which for me is really kind of almost the best part of this picture. I'm just going to zoom in a bit here. And not only do we, of course, get these amazing textures of glass, and especially here, I just love how the light flows through this sort of semi kind of rippled glass, and hits the tablecloth below here and casts this shadow. And then you get the very different sort of painted terracotta jug here. You just get a real sense of all of the different textures. And then, of course, you have this basket of fruit. Now, this, of course, goes very much back to what I was saying about Caravaggio's early training, about his training of painting still life and flowers and fruit. And the other thing about the fruit, of course, is that it's rotting. I mean, for me, it's not enticing, this fruit. I find it's bothering me because I want to push it back onto the table, but I don't really want to eat it. I can see kind of wormholes in there, and of course, these lovely features of the sort of the weave of the basket has kind of come loose. It's very momentary. We're very much sort of brought into this moment. And we get this sense of time passing. You know, it's not an idealized picture. We have rotten fruit, and of course, the idea of time passing again kind of leads us to this idea of vanitas, and including symbols of death. So, time passes as it will do for us. And this still life, of course, then, Rome was a center for artists, not only from Italy, but from all over Europe. And artists came to Rome, saw pictures like this by Caravaggio. And of course, he had this kind of ripple effect throughout the continent. And we then get sort of some of the best still lifes in the mid 17th century in the Low Countries in the north, by Dutch and Flemish artists. So his effect was very much lasting. Another thing, just going back to kind of the figures that we can see, they're not idealized either. So, we have a holy jacket, and we have sort of, as James has mentioned, sort of podgy Christ. We have sort of bearded stray hairs on the figure of the disciple. This sort of 5 o'clock shadow innkeeper. They're certainly not figures that we'd see in a painting by Raphael in the Vatican museums, in the Vatican apartments. And this is because Caravaggio, when he arrived in Rome, as we know, was incredibly poor and was using any models that he could get his hands on, and he didn't want to pay for them. So what he was very well known for was using people from the street. So whether they were prostitutes or beggars, and he used them, and was again criticized at the time for painting from nature. He painted without selecting. So many of the artists, they would select the perfect parts of various bodies to create the kind of ideal body. And this goes all the way back to sort of ancient Greece with the Apelles. And here you see Caravaggio is very much just painting what he sees. And this often got him into trouble. For example, he paints a scene of the death of the Virgin when he's in Rome for a church in Trastevere, for whoever knows Rome well. And it was in fact sent back because current contemporary artists had said that he had used the figure of a prostitute to depict the dead Virgin, which was of course incredibly controversial. And so it was sort of sent back, and another painting was put in its place. So this is something that you'll notice when you look at other paintings by Caravaggio, that these are very much sort of normal people. But I think what's really unique about Caravaggio is that he is such a lone artist. I mean, there is perhaps a studio assistant, which we see kind of popping up in a number of his paintings, but he doesn't really have a studio in the traditional sense. And he doesn't have a very long career. You have other artists like Titian who are painting into their 80s, and Caravaggio sort of dies in his 30s. But and he's sort of been painting on his own and in his very unique, independent way. And he does travel, but only within Italy. He doesn't sort of move around various courts in Europe like some of the other artists. And he tragically dies incredibly young. So.